will note that this is the Tuesday, November 20th meeting. We're in the City Hall, and it's 4 o'clock. We're starting on time. I apologize for that. I try not to ever do that. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Does anybody have any questions or additions to the minutes from our last meeting? Seeing none, Mr. Davis moves the minutes and Mr. Holloman seconds. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. Oh, I should note also that everyone is here, and we have a quorum, and all the members are here. I apologize for not saying that in the beginning. The second thing we do is move into the Ethics Officer Report, and we will go through items A through I on the agenda one at a time, stop at the end of each one to ask questions. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized on 3A.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as usual, I'm providing you with the report of my activities since our last meeting. Most relevant is that since the last time we met, we did have an election. So we have a new mayor and 2 new commissioners. Those individuals were sworn in last night. I've been in contact with each of them to outreach, and I will be telling them a little bit about our board and what it's about, probably before the next full commission meeting on December 5th. So that's number 1. Number 2, the ballot measure that would give the board its 7th member that it was supposed to have at inception, that did pass by 58% of the vote. So we are, I'll speak for myself, happy to know that we'll have that 7th member to be appointed by the Public Defender's Office. Our treasurer clerk is responsible for outreach to that elected official. That outreach has been made, and I've been told that we should know the identity of that individual and also of the individual to be filling, not replacing, Mr. Davis in the December meeting. So both State Attorney Campbell and the Public Defender will be making appointments, and hopefully we'll be able to chat about that in December. Other than that, we are planning to have an ethics education for all of the commissioners and the mayor and leadership team in January 2019. That's traditionally when that's done for the elected, appointed officials and their staff. So I'm available to answer any questions.
Okay, questions? If the board members don't object, I would like to suggest that when Ms. Meadows-Keefe meets with the newly elected officials, that she point out to them that we plan to make recommendations concerning ethics in the city, including the jurisdiction of this board, along with other things, sometime in the spring, and maybe even ask if there are specific things that they would like us to explore to go on our list, because they might have an idea, something we haven't thought about, or they might suggest a slightly different spin on something we've thought about, and if it accomplishes the same goal, I'm always happy to take whatever path as long as it gets us to the destination. So if anybody doesn't have any problem with her adding that in the discussion. Mr. Holloman? No? Okay.
So good. Just to clarify, Mr. Chair, so if I have that list of items, I can talk to them about
that we're considering a broad list, a broad array of items that we will narrow down and submit to them formally in the spring.
Okay.
Also, I'd note on the state attorney, the public defender appointment, I had a number of discussions with private citizens asking about that, and one of the confusions was many of them did not know we already had an appointment by the state attorney. They seem to think that having the public defender appoint somebody would somehow unbalance our board, and most of them, once they understood that there was it actually balanced, in a sense, the state attorney appointment, and they understood that that wasn't a specific recommendation of ours. Our only concern was that we have a 7th member for quorum purposes. They seemed to feel that they were better educated on the issue. Okay, item 3B, complaints. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
continuing, Mr. Chair, there were a total of 4 issues reported since the last meeting. I'll go first to number 148, and I'm recommending a closure of that because the targeted marketing of tobacco products in particular neighborhoods is not within the jurisdiction of this board. So my recommendation is to close that.
Seeing no objection. Can I ask one thing? Could we consider on adding a new column that would say whether it is a hotline complaint or an ethics complaint? Because when I read the charter, it looks like the ethics officer basically is in charge of hotline complaints, whereas the board is in charge of ethics complaints.
What if one is the same? What if there's a hotline
If it's both, then I think it's an ethics complaint, even though you may also do a referral. But you say on the note that the individual who called recognized it was not within the purview of the board on ethics. So this, to me, is pretty clearly hotline, and that would help us, I think, expedite our decision that if you recommend something that we go with your recommendation, because it's under the charter, it's really your responsibility anyway.
Got it. Okay, so number 149 is similar to that in that the person does understand that the safety rating of the hospital isn't something within the jurisdiction of the board. So again, that's something that I would close.
Any questions or objections? Seeing no objections. Next item.
Okay. The next one is number 150, and this complainant, this was received via email to ethics@talgov.com, not the hotline, that 2 employees misrepresented or lied about their education to receive jobs, and what they were complaining about is that there were other people, I guess, that had those qualifications. But these are people that have worked for the city for quite a while. But what I did is I forwarded that to Human Resources per our bylaw for the Human Resources Director to look at, and I will find out.
Okay. Questions?
But I am recommending that get closed.
Objections? Without objection, item 151.
And finally, number 151, I think we're going to talk about this particular issue maybe later in the agenda, but for right now, this is that kind of recurring complaint from a citizen related to access to City Hall and being able to meet with staff. So that's something that should be familiar to the board, but on this particular aspect of the complaint, I did recommend closure of it.
Okay, and I think this is an issue we've looked at a couple times in the past, and our board attorney is going to be talking to us more about it later on the agenda. So without objection, we'll move on. That puts us on item C, the monthly budget report. I will note for your purposes that the expected November expenses on salaries and benefits are substantially higher than they were in October. That's a function of 2 different things. One is there are 3 pay periods in November, and the other is how we pay our staff based on the city pay schedule, and the way they show those salary and benefit expenses at the close of the fiscal year, the city fiscal year, which is September 30, in order to put all of the 2017-18 services in the 2017-18 budget. So there's a bubble in September, and then you've got the 3 pay periods in November, and as I understand that explains, so there's nothing unusual here other than 3 pay periods, and we did for our staff the same thing the city did, which was the city did a 3% across the board, I think.
Yes, Mr. Chair, they did.
So we have traditionally done, when we did, we approved that same, we adopted the same, whatever the city did, we would do. So And other than that, I think everything else on here is pretty much straightforward monthly, month-to-month kind of expenditures. So any questions? Item 3D is the lengthy public records report. And unless anybody has questions, a lot of these are details on very specific things. I would suggest we just go ahead and move to item 3E, which are the kind of highlights that the city pulled out of that longer report in terms of public records requests. Most of these involve the prior mayor, and I suspect they were wrapped around an election cycle and may, once the public records are provided, I suspect a lot of this stuff will go away, just knowing how election cycles work. But if anybody has any questions on either 3D or 3E, or if there's anything that you want followed up, we can ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to do that. Seeing none, we will move on to 3F. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Mr. Chair, this document, what you'll see is a rather poor reproduction of a new org chart for the city. This is provided to you just for your information. A lot of these individuals have already come here to introduce themselves to you and to brief you on their particular job functions within the city. There has been a slight reorganization of leadership and responsibilities, and I also provided with you the explanation of this that Mr. Goad sent out. So he explained his reasoning for some of the restructuring and the specialty areas that are being emphasized and the needs for the reorganization. So this is just an informational piece for you because I want you all to know who's responsible for what particular functions here at the city.
Okay. So one of the big differences is there's no longer a deputy city manager. There are a couple of assistant city managers. There's no longer a deputy. And with the board's concurrence, I'd like Ms. Meadows-Keefe to look in our bylaws and see if there are any of these changes that would need to be reflected in our bylaws. If our bylaws say refer something to a particular position and that position has been renamed or moved or deleted, that we need to just fix those as technical items, and she could have that for us next month if that's okay.
Mr. Chair, one quick question. I'm sure it's a nuance, but I don't understand the difference between a deputy city manager and an assistant city manager.
Mr. Chair, the deputy city manager would simply be the deputy chair of this board, that if the chair is not present, the deputy takes that over. So that's just the second in command, basically.
Right.
And the assistant city manager is over a particular department of the city.
Doesn't that mean, though, the assistant city manager is de facto number 2?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
He said would then all the assistant managers would be a de facto number 2. Yes, I suppose if Reese were incapacitated for some period of time until they could act to reorganize, that you'd have a kind of a collegial group doing it. I think before, as I recall, Reese was the deputy.
Yes.
For the prior city manager, so he just automatically filled in. Now you would have, I suspect, if Reese were unavailable, that as issues came up, the other managers would step in, probably based on the content of the issue, or again collegially. But they don't have just a clear like vice city manager.
There's not a clear chain of command, is what you're telling me. I'm not pointing fingers. I'm just asking, because normally you do. You know, if you're on leave, if you have a medical reason or something like that, you say, okay, when I'm not here, so-and-so's in charge, and that would normally be the deputy. Is there any reason they changed it from a deputy to assistant, or is there any reason for that? I
think Reese attempts in this memorandum that we've got a copy of to set out the reasons for that. He's just trying to be
I will
conservative, but it does point out that Reese is not allowed to take a vacation or get sick.
Okay.
which moves us to item, where are we? G? No. I, thank you. Did I skip G, the revised guidebook?
You might have.
I have.
And
Ms. Meadows-Keefe, we'll jump back to G. I completely skipped over that. I apologize.
And you've got someone raising their hand in the audience, Mr. Chair.
Oh, okay. I'll come back to you, Mr. Simpson, just as soon as we finish item G here.
Okay. And Mr. Chair, the only reason that this is on the agenda is that I independently took on slight revisions to this Citizens Ethics Guide, which you'll recall is something that the board's required to produce. And it had not been updated since the city gave the board the additional authority over misuse of position and other items. And then I also updated it to indicate that we're going to have the public defender making an appointment. So I just wanted to make sure that this was updated so members of the public get an accurate view of what's going on.
Okay. Any questions of Ms. Meadows-Keefe concerning the ethics guide? Okay, before we go to 3I, Mr. Sims, you're recognized. Oh, Mr. Sims, that is farther down on the agenda. So for the record, since Mr. Sims was not at the microphone, he said that he was detained at the entrance, which is why he was not here when we started, and is interested in his prior complaints. I think that is item 9 on the agenda, so we'll get to a full discussion when we get to item 9. Okay. Right, right. So you're kind of on twice, but the real discussion occurs on item 9. So we are on item 3I. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
And Mr. Chair, this is just a clarification email that was sent related to the term of the public defender appointee and when they would start and how long the term would be. So initially, that appointee would serve for 1 year, at which point they'd be eligible to serve additional, I think, up to 7 years.
Right. So our policy has been you can't be appointed to a new 3-year term if it's your third 3-year term. So if you have a 2, then you can do 2 3s. If you have a 3, then initial 3, then you only get 1 more 3. But it keeps us on a cycle so that we don't ever have all 7 of us being appointed in one fell swoop. So actually, nothing unusual there other than we'll have 2 new members in January. State attorney will be here with us for 3. The appointment will be for 3. The public defenders will be for 1. Mr. Holloman?
Just trying to count where we're going to put the next extra person.
Yeah. We're going to have bunk chairs here in the middle.
Okay.
Item 4 relates to Amendment 12. You all will remember we passed a bunch of constitutional amendments to the Florida Constitution in the election, and this one in particular relates to city officials. So, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you want to do this one?
I will, but I am going to just point out that I'm not sure there's agreement on all aspects of what I wrote because there was a subsequent email that was put out by the city attorney's office that I think we'll discuss. But the bottom line is that the 6-year ban that passed prevents legislators and other elected officials from lobbying the organization that they were elected to for 6 years. This is an increase from the 2 years in place before. And if the sources that I searched are accurate, this is now the strictest ban in the country that Florida has for the delay in lobbying. And it adds some additional requirements that the Commission on Ethics is to define what a disproportionate benefit is and determine penalties by October 1st, 2019. So that was a term that had not been defined, so they now have a job to do that. Now, the open question is the full financial disclosure Form 6. The chair and I were talking about whether the expanded definition of official that includes municipal electeds pertains just to that section or to the disclosure part of, I'm not explaining this very well, of the Constitution.
Let me take a crack. On page 2, the new
please.
language, on the copy of the constitutional language, we have page 2, subsection F, defines public officer, and has a bunch of requirements related to the 6-year lobbying ban. But it's the definition of public officer says for the purposes of this subsection. Well, the subsection is paren F. Now, there's some public disclosure up in paren B, but the way I read this new definition of public officer in paren F would not apply to paren B. So whether or not what the implications of that are, I don't know, but there has been some confusion about that. And also note that the 6-year ban on lobbying your prior governmental entity takes effect December 31st, 2018. So it is not yet in effect, and I assume would not affect any government official who leaves office before December 31st of this year. They would be under the current 2-year ban, because this would not be in effect when they leave office. So I'm sure we will hear more on several of these constitutional amendments. This one has some other, raises some questions, at least in my mind, on other topics, but I'm sure we'll hear more as the legislature gets a chance to pass some enacting legislation and people get a chance to ask some of the questions in the gray areas. But are there any questions now from the board members? Okay, seeing none. We are on Blue Sky recommendations. I think everybody has seen this list before. I'd like to ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to expand on page 1, the subpoena part, rather than just subpoenas, as alternatives to include subpoenas ducis tecum or subpoenas of documents or interrogatories. I think that's the right term for submitting to someone a set of written questions which they answer in writing under oath. If the city commission objected to giving us subpoena power, they might be willing to do something, taking a step in that direction, just so we have some options to consider before we make our recommendations. Mr. Holloman.
Is there any part of municipal government that currently has subpoena power?
I don't know the answer to that, but Ms. Meadows-Keefe can get it for us next month, unless there's someone here who knows.
I'm seeing a shaking of head from the deputy city attorney indicating no. Oh, you don't know the answer?
I'm sorry, the question was whether there's currently any part of municipal government that has subpoena power. Both.
I can get the answer.
I'm curious as to whether or not there would be some kind of requirement that we have some legislation that would, from the state level, because I'm not sure how we interact with the courts on these kind of things. It's just an interesting question I have not
Right.
really pondered. But
it may be something the city can't give us. We need to do more. And that's one, a lot of these, we haven't done all the background research. These, again, were just literally blue sky
Sure.
ideas. And it could be something as simple as us allowing a person who would appear before us in a formal hearing to be under oath. Even that is potentially a question. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
Since we are sending matters to DOA for adjudication, those DOA judges do issue subpoenas for documents and for witness testimony. So I don't know how that interfaces with this.
Yeah, it would be a kind of a matter of how complete a record we could build in a case that ultimately went to DOA.
I mean, it goes to our investigative powers.
Right.
You know, how much can we do really without that power?
Right. So maybe we can get a thoughtful opinion on that for the next meeting?
If you would like, yes, sir.
Can we ask our board counsel and our
Absolutely.
ethics officer to kind of jointly look at that? Because obviously we don't want to ask the city commission for something they can't give us or for something they don't have. That just would appear foolish. Here's what I'd like to do. We'll have 2 new members in January, and so I'd like to not make any recommendations until we get our new members so that everybody's invested in this. No offense, Mr. Davis. You'll still be invested. You'll be the ghost voting in the background. But what I'd like to do for the next meeting is if the board members, including myself, would look through these and identify those things that they think are non-starters or not yet ripe, whatever. Don't pick the things you definitely want to do, but let's start weaning the list down. If you would either be prepared at the next meeting or if before the next meeting you would tell Ms. Meadows-Keefe things that you think are ready to come off the list. If we get a couple veto notes, then we'll start to squeeze the list down simply by taking, it's kind of that, I think, military approach. You take a couple things off the bottom and you narrow the list down. I think there's some approach like that, Colonel Grant, for decision making. But this is, at this point, a pretty long list, and again, it's pretty open-ended. So if there's something that you say, I think maybe this needs to come off unless you can assure me that, whatever, then the staff can work on it for the next meeting. And by the time we get to January, we'll have a more refined list when we have 7 members, including 2 new members. So if that's okay, if everybody would take that as a homework assignment, you can just put a X through anything you don't like and shoot it to Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
And board members can call me or come by to chat about anything on the list that you'd want to talk about. So if you want to be more thoughtful and have a discussion, obviously please call.
And that does not mean that we won't be discussing things in the future, because clearly whatever we submit to the city in terms of recommendations and recommendations to ourselves for things we need to change, ideally would not be a simple majority, but would be a unanimous vote. So item 6 on the agenda, Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
And
that's the bylaw, change in the bylaws?
Got it. And this is basically a technical change where we're substituting public defender for chief judge.
So this would just comply now with the change in the city charter?
We'll just conform that, yes.
Okay. Mr. Smith is going to move this, and Mr. Davis is going to second. So all the members in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say nay, and that one is approved. With that, we are going to take about a 15-minute break till about 4:45, and then we will be back and quickly roll through the rest of these. And we are back after a short break. Next item on our agenda is the appointment of a board member. You will remember our bylaws say we appoint 2 of the members to this board ourselves, and Dr. Grant is one of those, and our bylaws say that if such a member is eligible to serve another term and wishes to be reappointed, that would be our first path. So, Dr. Grant, I guess I get to ask you if it is your desire to remain on the board.
Mr. Chair, thank you. It is my privilege to have served on this board, and it would be my privilege to continue serving on it.
All right. Mr. Davis moves that Dr. Grant continue, and Ms. McNeil seconds the motion. All in favor say aye. Mr. Grant, you don't get to vote. Aye. And opposed say nay. The ayes have it. Dr. Grant, you are welcome to join the party for the next 3 years.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, members.
Okay. The next item, I am going to recognize Ms. Marsteller on item 9. We remember at the last meeting, we asked her to look at the complaints, at a group of complaints that had come from the same complainant. She has prepared a memorandum, and I would particularly recommend the first 2 pages because it is a wonderful summary of the jurisdiction of this board concerning ethics and the jurisdiction of the ethics officer concerning hotline calls and complaints. So, Ms. Marsteller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the 2 pages that you've just referred to, I needed to do that also for me to make sure that as I was looking at and reviewing the complaints, that I made sure that I knew exactly what the board's jurisdiction was, and that this would be sort of my framework, right, for looking at the complaints. Now, you all will see, and if you want me to step through each complaint, there were 5. If you want me to step through each one, I can. But what I did with each one was look at what was complained about, what the allegations were, and to the extent that any of the complaints contained more than one allegation, I broke those out for the board. Looked at each allegation in relation to this board's jurisdiction, i.e., the kinds of violations that the board has jurisdiction to take action on, and then reached a conclusion as to whether or not the particular complaint or the allegations within that complaint, if true, would constitute a violation that would come within the board's jurisdiction. I did not do a deep dive into the investigations that were done. I didn't gather that that's what you asked me to do. It was really more of a look at the face of the complaint and see. And that's that's exactly what I've done here. And on each complaint, with each allegation, as the board will see in my report, the bottom line is that none of the allegations that were made in each one of these 5 complaints falls within the jurisdiction of this board and within its authority to impose any kinds of penalties. Now, I do understand, certainly from a citizen's perspective, that would be, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not satisfying. That I understand. But from this board's perspective, these particular complaints were correctly closed as outside the board's jurisdiction.
Okay, and let me just restate something, what I think I just heard you say. In each case, you took, without doing a separate investigation, you took the complaint on its face, assuming that everything in the complaint, if it were true, then you evaluated it on that basis.
Correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
Questions of our board counsel? Ms. Tolleman.
I have one question. It kind of goes back to there was on the first page of, again, I agree with the chair that this is a very helpful summary for all of us. But one of the things that is within our purview is misuse of public position, but it only applies to an elected or an appointed official. I'm trying to remember, I don't believe misuse is a defined term in any way. But I'm just curious as to whether or not waste, fraud, and abuse would fall within misuse. I believe it would be, but I'm wondering if we're taking that position or not, or if we're taking a position such that if an elected or appointed official was engaged in waste, fraud, or mismanagement, would that be misuse of public position?
In Section 2-6 of the Ethics Code, that is the provision regarding misuse of public position. The language there in subsection A says, no elected or appointed official shall corruptly use or attempt to use his or her official position or any city property or resource, et cetera, to secure a special privilege, benefit, or exemption for themselves or others valued at more than $25. So there is, although misuse, that particular term is not defined, within the context of the paragraph A here, if there's an allegation of fraud, in my opinion, in order to come within this definition here, within this provision, there would also need to be an additional allegation that there was some benefit or exemption.
So the misuse is tied to the special benefit, really?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That helps. Thank you.
And then, of course, our ongoing problem, the word corruptly in there creates effectively a criminal law type standard. It's beyond knowingly and intentionally.
So I guess maybe we could have the discussion about whether we think that that's the appropriate standard. Should it be tied to special benefit, or should it be broader, that we could look at waste, fraud, and abuse even if it wasn't a special benefit involved?
Right, and I think that's one of the items, or maybe a couple of the items I know one of our blue sky items is to change corruptly to knowingly and intentionally. But I think, yes, there definitely, I think conceptually is an overlap between what is a potential hotline complaint and what is an ethics complaint. And those, it seems to me, where it has one foot in each area, those ought to be things that we look at, but it's going to take some tweaking of that language. So that's in your homework over the next month.
Okay, fair enough.
Any other questions from board members? Yes, sir, you're recognized.
My name is Stanley Sims. I'm at 1320 Avondale Way. And I like to say there is an incident because, and I want to tell Ms. Simone, I really appreciate our conversation that we had over the phone. I appreciate the patience. And I appreciate your value in seeing how personal this is to me. It is quite challenging to be 52 years old, living in 2018, and have to go this far for justice. That is hard. And so I do want you to understand that I do acknowledge your professionalism. And I'm trying so hard to be. Before I came up here, I had people in this community who wanted to make sure, because the first time I started this journey, Ms. Simone, I came up here with Amazon tea and a hoodie and candy, and they thought that was a little overblown. It muttered my passion, and it muttered my point. And so they've been working with me. And so they've been calling me today, Mr. Davis, and one of the lawyers, he asked me, he said, what are you going to say? He said, how are you going to do it? I said, what do you think? He said, Stanley, I want you to stay on the point of law. Argue the point of law. Tone down your passion. Then I called my spiritual advisor. And he told me, he said, I would never normally tell anybody to follow their heart. He said, well, with you, I'm going to tell you to tame your heart. But here's what I find challenging. And I believe I can, because of Mr. Holloman's question, I believe there's a place where there's further investigation. I can prove, in order to turn me down, they changed the rules. That every time that I set and accomplished the rules that was placed before me for my program to come forth, they changed the rules and require more. I can prove that. A further investigation will prove that. I can also prove that with my blocking of access to this building is an abuse of power because I fulfilled the obligations and they were still in place. So if we did a real thorough just upon the abuse of power or fraud, now, Mr. Holloman, I need to ask a question from you. How do you define fraud? Because based on your definition of fraud, I can demonstrate to this board for evidence that has already been presented to Ms. Julie F. Keefe that there has been fraud. The number one fraud is 2 years ago, and Ms. Julie Keefe can attest to this, is that they informed me that the only way that my program could be funded is through the CHSP process. I don't know if a fraud is constituted as a lie, but the auditor is with us today, and he will tell you that there has been programs that are parallel to mine that were funded outside of the CHSP process. Not only do I can demonstrate that he has been prejudiced or discriminatory towards me program-wise, I can also prove where there has been fraud using city employees to maximize stories in order to put these security restrictions in place. If Ms. Simone, that if you would interview or make a telephone call with the board's permission to Chief Gaines alone, I can point out 2 incidents with Chief Gaines that shows fraud. Now, if you call fraud a lie, now Donna Brazile told me, who is the chairman of the Florida Democrat, when you change the rules in the middle of the game, that's called cheating. And I can prove that. I can prove with a sworn officer that he has fabricated stories. And what he has told you is not correct. And that fraud amounts to ill restrictions of my right to a government building that my wife works in for over 20 years. A government building who has given me a proclamation, a government building who I have worked several city-wide organizations with, and I'm now being treated as if I'm an enemy combatant and I'm only seeking refuge But this management, this administration has dispersed armed troops with barbed wire, who have told them to, when we get here, despite the 23 homicides, 8 of them were my friends. 5, we went to school together. That's how hard that is. And I don't want this here nice cleaned up stuff to make you think I'm perfect, because Ms. Simone, I'm not. But I recognize it's only God's grace. And it wasn't 24, and I was one of them. And so to deny me the right to access my government, that's taxation without representation. And in my book, that's fraud. So I'm asking you, Mr. Chairman, again, how long will I cry out? Until there is no more breath in my body. Because unfortunately, Ms. Salone, as I talk to Mr. Holloman, things may not be right, does not make them illegal. And I will not allow this illegal act to go in the dark. Because something here is just not right. My restrictions, Chairman, ended on October 26th. Out of the abundance of caution, I called the Chief Gaines. Had to do it several times. I demonstrated in this meeting how difficult it is for this black man to reach the 4th floor, even after a Category 4 storm. I demonstrated that. To me, that's fraud, because my utility bill has not decreased. I'm not getting an allowance for less service. Chief Gaines, I got him on the phone. I said, Chief, he said, everything's good. You can go. I said, no. He said, you don't need a lot. I said, for me to clear up any mishaps, because if anything go wrong, Chief, it's going to be on me. He said, okay, Stanley, I'm going to get you a letter. So, Chief, Chairman, you think I would rush down the next day to get my letter? No, because it's not about that. I waited. Came November 8th, several days. Didn't actually come that day just to test the waters as I was accused of. Colonel Grant, I came that day because my son was graduating, scheduled to graduate from boot camp. And I was trying to do some last-minute logistics with my wife. My son missed the running part by 30 seconds. So his graduation was delayed to the 7th. That's not something you tell your wife over the phone. So the security guard informed me that the restrictions were still in place. And Ms. Simone, very nice people. have invested a lot of time in me. And so I didn't want to show my butt today. Can I just talk real for a minute? I didn't want to show my butt that day. So I went into that security office, boiling on the inside, and I said, Miss Barbary, normally in situations like this here, you're going to think I'm being rude or disrespectful. I say, but today I don't want that to happen. I said, now I'm frustrated. I'm trying to get out of town. My son, all of these things are going on. I don't need to tell my wife this. I need to tell this in faith. I said, but we got an issue here. She calls up to the 4th floor. A city employee comes down and curses me out, accuses me of all of these bad things. And I felt so good, Miss Simone, because I just stood there. I didn't give a word for word. It got so bad that the security officer had to step in between us and ask me to leave. Not because I was the one doing the bad stuff, but because she was so agitated at me. And when we got outside, because I'm feeling so good, because, I ain't showing my butt. So this 6 months have really taught me something. He thought it was bad, but he's really done something for my good. And I tell her, I say, if your name was Stanley Sims, they would restrict your access. And you know what she told me? I know, but I'm glad my name ain't Stanley Sims. But I'm going to tell you, to you and to this committee, I'm not ashamed of who I am. I have not always been right. But I am ashamed that this government will allow something like this to happen to even the least of me. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your patience and allowing me to speak. But I think we got fraud here. I'm going to go to the Ethics Commission. But my main purpose was doing this here, and I shared it with Mr. Holloman, is to demonstrate to the citizens and to the city employees what your role is and what you can and cannot do, because coming to you and giving a claim, Ms. Simone, exposes people. It exposes our city employees, and it demonstrates to them that repercussions is coming and you all can't do anything about it. So for me, for you to walk away to say that this is just about Stanley would be a tragedy. It's Stanley today. But will it be Renee McNeil's son tomorrow? It's Stanley today. Colonel Grant, will it be my son who come back, who's fighting and catching hell for democracy? Will it be him? Martin Luther King said, a threat to justice anywhere, even at Stanley Sims' address, is a threat to justice everywhere. White, black, rich, or poor. Thank you.
Questions of Mr. Sims? Seeing none. The next item on the agenda, number 10, this is related to parking passes. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I'm going to recognize you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this, again, is just an informational piece for the board's information. You'll recall back probably 2 months ago, the board asked that I provide the city attorney with the board's assessment of the utilization of airport parking passes given to various officials in the city and county in leadership positions. And this is her response, indicating that she has spoken with the city manager and a decision will be made in the future about use of those passes.
Okay. Anybody need Ms. Meadows-Keefe to follow up on that? As we go to items for future agendas, I would like to make a motion. I guess I can do that. Our bylaws require that we choose the next chair and vice chair in our December meeting so that they can come in the January meeting and have a chance to have set the agenda with the ethics officer. Our bylaws also allow the waiver of the bylaws by a 2/3 vote. Because we are going to have the full 7 members and actually have 2 new members here who will be serving for the next few years, what I would like to propose is that we delay the selection of the chair and vice chair until our January meeting when we have our 2018 full membership. That would require a affirmative vote of 2/3 of the members here.
So moved.
Okay, and I'm seeing Dr. Grant
Second.
shake his head, so we got a second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
And opposed say nay. Okay, so we have added that now. Is there anything that anybody wants on the next agenda? Given that it's in December, is this 4 o'clock time frame okay for people? Do we need to, or, I mean, we can move back because I think we've been able to get done a little bit early. 4 o'clock's good. Public comment. Anyone else in the public who would like to comment, or even from the city staff who would like to comment? Seeing none, our next meeting will be Tuesday, December 18th, 4 to 7 here in the City Commission chamber, and with that, we are adjourned.